Hi everyone, we're back for part two, and we left off by talking about how play, according to Vygotsky, can facilitate decentration. And in this example, it has to do with children focusing on one dimension of a person and putting themselves in somebody else's shoes. So they can kind of foster theory of mind by putting themselves in somebody else's shoes while doing pretend play. So this brings us to our first question. And this question I'd like you to write down. So take out a piece of paper if you haven't already been taking notes. And this is the question that you're going to answer on the discussion board. So the question is, how can we assess what types of skills are developing when children are playing? So think of some examples. So we've looked at all these different areas of development. Think about what kinds of developmental skills. And if you're trying hard to think about what are developmental skills, take out that blue sheet with the grid that we looked at the TREE book, the Washington State Early Learning and Development Guidelines book, and take a look at some of those developmental areas. Look at some of those developmental milestones, and then think about some examples of how play can facilitate those specific skills. And then think about how can we assess them? How do we measure it? How do we know? That's what you're going to answer. That's one of the questions that you're going to answer in the discussion. All right, moving on. Let's talk about a really special type of play, and this is dramatic play. So dramatic play has a bunch of different elements. It might be imitative role playing, so it might be playing house, playing family. It might be make-believe using objects, so children might take a bunch of Legos and pretend that they're something else and engage in dramatic play scenario with those. They might make believe with actions and situations. So these kids here in the picture are at a supermarket, and one person is stocking the shelves, one person is the clerk, and some other ones are the customers. In dramatic play, children are pretty persistent, so they want to keep on going. They really do. They're very motivated for this. And they're also interested in interacting with one another. So this facilitates social skills because they're interacting with one another, and they're doing a lot of verbal communication. So this is what dramatic play is all about. So now we're going to talk about 3 different frameworks for stages of play. The first and the most famous one, the one you're going to encounter in many other classes, is the Mildred-Parton stages of play. And this all has to do with social play, so how children play with another kid. So the stages of play according to Parton are first solitary play. This happens in infancy. So children are playing alone and they're playing with objects. They're playing with toys. After this comes parallel play. So this is in the toddler years. And children during parallel play are playing side by side with each other. They're playing with the toys, but they're not really interacting with each other that much. But then they get into associative play in the early preschool years. And so here they're in pairs or they're in groups, and they might have some brief interactions. But they're not really doing a lot of sharing, and they're not really doing a lot of negotiation. So they might be playing with the same toy. They might all be playing with blocks, but they're all sort of doing their own thing. Maybe they dabble a little bit in, interacting, but it's mostly doing your own thing, but we're in the same area with the same toys. And then cooperative play is older children, kindergarten, older preschool. And here is where kids are really working together to create scenarios cooperatively. So that's why it's called cooperative play. And when you're working with children, you really do see these stages of play out. You can really see whatever age kids are at, you can find out what stage of play they're in by watching them. Okay, so let's talk about another theory or a framework for stages of play. This is done by our old friend Jean Piaget and later expanded upon by Smolansky, which I think is a super fun name to say, Smolansky. And they look at the cognitive stages of play. So this really maps onto Piaget's framework almost exactly. So Piaget's framework, the first 2 years has practice or functional play, and this is characterized by sensory qualities of objects, so how a rattle feels when you shake it. Can you feel the vibrations of the beads inside the rattle? What does a piece of fabric feel like when you put it in your mouth? You're practicing motor skills, picking things up, dropping them, that sort of stuff. Then comes symbolic play, and this is your whole early childhood years. So there's constructive play, so that's when you're using object representation. Maybe you're using a banana as a telephone. although I anticipate that that will stop being such a fun thing to do because now telephones don't look like that anymore. They look like smartphones. And then they start to engage in dramatic or socio-dramatic play. And this is the dramatic play we talked about a couple slides ago. This happens ages 2 to 7 because kids have the cognitive ability to understand symbols during this stage. Then around 7 to 11 years, that's when kids can sort of start to follow rules. This is when kids are more interested in creating rules and following rules, and they negotiate rules together. You might notice that kids at this age become really rigid about the rules and they hate to break the rules because they've just sort of started, especially like 7, 8, 9-year-olds, because they've just sort of started to understand rule games, and once they get a handle on that, they like to really follow them. So, these stages really map onto cognitive abilities that are available to children at the different ages that they're at. The third framework is a Vygotskian framework, so back to Vygotsky. So instead of the zone of proximal development, we're going to talk about what he thought about stages of play. And remember, Vygotskian perspective is social and cognitive. So he thought there were 3 main components of play. That children create imaginary situations, they take on roles and then they act them out, and then they follow rules determined by those roles. So their imaginary situation here in this picture is, it looks like dinner time. Maybe they're at a restaurant, and so, or maybe they're doing a family dinner. And so that's their situation. And then one might be one parent, one might be another parent, and one might be the kid. And then they're going to follow a set of rules. So if one girl, let's say the girl on the left in the purple is the mother, then maybe she is saying to the other children or to the other child, make sure to eat your vegetables, and say things that really sort of map onto her role. So that's what Vygotsky thought about play. Vygotsky and Enlund had this whole theory about the stages of play, and it had 4 levels. And so level 1 was sort of object-centered. They didn't really name the roles. There weren't really hardcore rules. Then in level 2, they did name the roles. So like, you're the mom, you're the dad, you're the kid. And the actions that they do have to be associated with the role. So if you're the mom, you can't like act like a kid and suck your thumb and ask your diaper changed. You know, you got to like, tell people what to do and be the mom. At level 3, they really plan it out a little bit more. So they say, okay, who's going to be what? And they don't sort of swap roles all the time. Sometimes when you see young children doing role games, they change roles all the time. At level 3, they might sort of stick to their roles. And children make sure to regulate each other's behavior. Like, hey, you're the mom. You wouldn't have said that if you were the mom. And they use a different tone of voice to mimic the adult. And then at level 4, it's much more developed. They plan the actions much more deeply. They stay in character. And the scenarios are much more consistent and logical. So, like, unrealistic things won't happen as much. Of course, there'll still be imaginary scenarios. But kids are more interested in, like, following the rules of what's going on. So if they're playing airplane, it's not going to be like all of a sudden the flight attendant goes and flies the plane, because they want to make sure they're following everybody's role. They're much more strict about it. All right, here's your second question for the discussion board. So I would like you guys to also discuss in the board, why is it useful for early childhood educators to understand these different stages? So we looked at 3 different frameworks for understanding stages of play. Now I want you guys to discuss with each other, why do we need to know this stuff? How is it going to help us serve these children better? All right, finally, let's talk about the role of adults in play, and we'll wrap up with talking about culture in adults in play. So there's this idea called guided participation, and this is where adults and children can interact during instruction and during activities. It's related to the zone of proximal development, it's related to day-to-day activities, and it can work to enhance memory. And I think I have the next slide that's going to be talking about this. A little bit, yeah. I'm going to put up a video, actually, that's going to show you guided participation. So watch that video. I think it can do a better job of describing it than I can. It has Maria Rogoff in it, so it'll be called the Maria Rogoff video. Watch that video. All right, another way adults can participate in kids' play is something called shared remembering. So this is a script of a shared remembering scenario between Mother and Brittany. Let's say Brittany is 2.5. Mother says, Brittany, what's at the park? Brittany says, it's a baby thing. Or she says, baby swing. That's right, the baby swing. And what else? Brittany shrugs. A slide. Brittany smiles and nods. What else is at the park? Brittany shrugs. Mother says, a sea. Brittany says, a seesaw. That's right, a seesaw. So Mom is kind of helping Brittany remember what was going on at the park when they were there. Another way adults can have a role in play is talking to and reading to children. So there might be, when reading a story, it might be more interactive. So asking comprehension questions or open-ended questions. What do you think about starting a rock band? Would you like to play the drums? And creating play opportunities that are based on those book themes. So that's like the example I gave in video 1, where maybe you read a book about kids starting a band, and then you make sure that in dramatic play they have all the materials they need. Adults can also be the more skilled partner to engage in dramatic play with. So sometimes kids don't know how the scenario goes. Maybe they don't know that when they're in an airplane, the flight attendants don't ever take a turn flying the plane. And so adults can sort of help set up the scenarios with kids if they're invited in the play. All right, so we're going to wrap it up with another quote by our dear Fred Rogers. And Fred Rogers says, "When we treat children's play as seriously as it deserves, we are helping them feel the joy that is to be found in the creative spirit. It's the things we play with and the people who help us play that make a great difference in our lives." So I want to leave you guys with that quote. I want you to think about the importance of play, and not just the importance of play in development, but all of these structures that are associated with it. Make sure to check in on the discussion board, and I'm going to post a couple of videos that I'd like you guys to watch, and I'll maybe include that in the discussion as well. So have a good day.